Forest mysteries. The chain rattled before he saw her. Philip stopped mid-step, his snowshoe sinking 6 inches into fresh powder. The sound came from ahead, somewhere in the spruce thicket where he'd set the leg-hold traps 3 days ago. It wasn't the wind. The wind moaned. It whistled. It sometimes screamed across the ridgeline. But it didn't rattle chain against iron. He unslung his rifle and held it across his chest, more habit than intention. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since morning. His beard was stiff with ice from his own breath. At -30, metal froze to bare skin. At -30, a man didn't make mistakes. The trail wound through the cedars, their branches heavy with snow, forming a tunnel that blocked what light remained. It was just past 2 in the afternoon, but the sun had already slipped behind the ridge. The forest was the color of old bone. He found her at the base of a fallen hemlock. She was smaller than he expected. Wolves always were when you saw them up close. The legends made them into monsters, but this one was lean, her ribs showing through a coat of black fur that looked blue in the fading light. Her right front paw was caught in the trap, the iron jaws clamped just above the ankle. Blood had frozen on the snow around her, a dark stain that had stopped spreading hours ago. She raised her head when he came into view. Philip had seen wolves before, from a distance, always from a distance. He'd heard them howl at dusk, had found their tracks crossing his snowmobile trail, had once watched a pack take down a deer across a frozen lake. But he had never been this close to a living wolf. Her eyes were amber, not yellow like a dog's, but deep and gold, with pupils that contracted to slits in the light. She didn't snarl. She watched him with a stillness that was more terrifying than any noise. Her lips were pulled back just enough to show the teeth beneath. He crouched down, keeping the rifle between them. "Easy," he said. His voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud, too human. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't move. Her sides heaved with the effort of breathing. He could see where she'd tried to chew through the chain. The metal was scored, and there was blood on her muzzle. She had been here for a day, maybe 2, long enough to exhaust herself trying to escape, long enough to know she was going to die. The trap was illegal. He knew that as soon as he saw it. Leg-hold traps with teeth were banned years ago, but someone had set this one anyway, dragged it out here where no one would find it. The chain was wrapped around the hemlock's roots, anchored deep. She wasn't going anywhere. Philip could have walked away. That was the thought that sat in his chest like a stone. He could have turned around, followed his own tracks back to the snowmobile, driven home, and never mentioned this to anyone. The wolf would freeze tonight. The temperature would drop to 40 below. By morning she would be dead, and by spring there would be nothing left but bones and fur and a rusted trap that no one would claim. He had done this before. Set traps, checked them, killed what he caught. It was how he survived. The fur paid for supplies. The meat filled his freezer. He had never enjoyed it, but he had never lost sleep over it either. But this was different. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he saw something there that he couldn't name. Not fear, not hope, just a kind of terrible patience, the willingness to wait for whatever came next because there was no other choice. He thought of Elena. She had been the one who named it in him, that thing he couldn't name himself. "You have a soft heart," she used to say, even though you try to hide it behind all that flannel and silence. She had said it like it was a gift, not a weakness. She had said it like it was the reason she loved him. That was 3 years ago. 3 years since the cancer took her. 3 years since he had stopped being anyone's soft heart. Philip set the rifle down in the snow. He took off his heavy wool coat and spread it on the ground beside him. The cold hit him like a slap, cutting through his flannel shirt, raising goosebumps on his arms. He would have maybe 10 minutes before his fingers stopped working, maybe less. "All right," he said, and his voice was steadier now. "Let's get this over with." He approached her slowly, keeping low, talking the whole time. He told her about the weather, about the cabin, about the way the snow piled up against the windows in a storm. He told her about Elena's garden, how she had grown tomatoes in the summer despite the short season, how the cabin still smelled like her if he closed his eyes. The wolf watched him come, her body tensed, every muscle drawn tight as wire. But she didn't snarl. She didn't lunge. He got close enough to see the trap clearly. The teeth had gone deep into her leg, piercing the skin, the muscle, maybe the bone. The leg was swollen above the catch, the fur matted with frozen blood. She had been fighting for a long time. "I'm going to have to hold you down," he said. "You're going to hate it. I'm going to hate it. But it's the only way." He waited for a moment, as if she could understand him, as if she could give him permission. Then he moved. His left hand went to her neck, pressing her down against the coat. His right hand reached for the trap. She twisted under him, her teeth snapping inches from his face, her breath hot against his cheek. He could smell the blood on her, could smell her fear and her fury and her refusal to die. He found the release lever and pushed. The trap sprang open with a sound like a breaking bone. The wolf scrambled free, dragging her injured leg, and for a terrible moment Philip thought she would turn on him. Her teeth were bare, her ears flat against her skull. She was wild and wounded, and she had nothing left to lose. But she didn't bite. She pulled herself away from him, her body low to the ground, her injured paw leaving a trail of blood across the snow. At the tree line, she stopped. She looked back. Her amber eyes met his for one long heartbeat. There was nothing in them now but exhaustion and something else, something he couldn't read. Then she turned and vanished into the cedars. Philip sat in the snow for a long time. The cold had seeped into his bones, and his hands were shaking when he picked up his coat. There was blood on it, dark against the gray wool. He folded it over his arm and picked up his rifle. He walked back to the snowmobile in the gathering dark, and he did not look back at the trap, still open and waiting in the snow. The cabin was warm when he got home. He had left the stove burning low, and the heat hit him like a blessing when he pushed through the door. He hung his coat on the hook by the door, stoked the fire, put water on for tea. His arm stung when he moved it. He rolled up his sleeve and found 4 long scratches, red and angry, where her teeth had grazed his skin. Not a bite, just a warning. He cleaned them with whiskey and wrapped them in a strip of clean cloth. Later, sitting by the stove with a cup of tea, he thought about what he had done. He had let her go. He had walked away from a pelt that would have brought him $200, maybe more. He had risked being mauled for nothing. But it wasn't nothing. He thought about the way she had looked back at the tree line, the way she had paused, just for a moment, as if she was remembering him. He thought about Elena and the way she had looked at him the morning she died, as if she was trying to memorize his face. She would have freed the wolf too, he said to the empty room. The fire crackled in response. He finished his tea and went to bed. In the morning, he would go back to the trap line. He would check the other traps. He would kill what he needed to kill. Life would go on. But as he lay in the dark, listening to the wind push against the walls, he knew something had changed. The wolf was out there somewhere, injured and alone, surviving the cold that would have killed her. And he was in here, warm and fed and safe. He didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure it meant anything at all. He closed his eyes and slept. In the months that followed, he saw wolf tracks near his snowmobile trail more than once. They favored the right paw, just slightly, the stride a little uneven. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself that wolves traveled far, that there was no way one injured animal could track him across miles of forest. But he never set another trap in that part of the woods. And sometimes, when the snow was fresh and the light was just right, he thought he saw a shadow moving at the edge of the clearing, a shadow that limped, just slightly, as it disappeared into the trees. He never told anyone about what happened. It was his secret, his soft heart, hidden behind all that flannel and silence. And he kept it there, like a stone in his chest, waiting for winter to come again. The wind shifted at noon, and Philip smelled the storm before he saw it. He had been cutting firewood since first light, working a stand of dead birch 2 miles from the cabin. The morning had been clear and brutal, 40 below, the kind of cold that made your nostrils freeze together when you breathed. But the sky had held a pale, washed-out blue, and the forecast had called for clear skies through the weekend. He had trusted the forecast. That was his first mistake. The smell came out of the northwest, rolling across the ridges like something alive. It was the smell of a storm, metallic and electric, the scent of the atmosphere itself compressing. Philip straightened up from the birch he was bucking, his chainsaw idling in his hand, and watched the sky turn from blue to gray to a bruised purple in the space of 20 minutes. He had maybe 10 minutes to get back to the snowmobile. He left the saw in the snow and started walking. The sled was a quarter-mile away, parked on the old logging road where the trees opened up enough to ride. He moved as fast as his snowshoes would carry him, but the cold had stiffened his legs from crouching, and the fresh snow was deeper than he had expected. His breath came in hard clouds, freezing on his beard, building a crust of ice that cracked when he moved his jaw. The snow arrived like a wall. One moment he could see the trees ahead of him, the gray trunks standing against the gray sky. The next moment there was nothing but white. The wind hit him at the same time, a solid force that knocked him sideways, and suddenly he could not tell which direction he had been facing. He dropped to his knees and waited. The first rule of a whiteout was to stay still. Moving without a reference point meant walking in circles, and walking in circles meant death. He had told himself this 100 times, had repeated it to younger hunters who thought they knew better. But knowing the rule and following it were different things when the cold was eating through your clothes and the wind was screaming like a wounded animal. He stayed down for what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes. When the wind paused, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe, he stood up and kept walking. The snowmobile was where he had left it, a dark shape against the trees. He reached it with hands that had gone numb inside his mittens, his fingers thick and clumsy. The key was in his pocket. He got it out, got it into the ignition, and pulled the starter cord. Nothing. He pulled again. The engine coughed, caught for half a second, and died. The third pull gave him nothing at all. He looked at the gas gauge and saw the needle resting on empty. He had meant to fill it yesterday. He had told himself he would do it in the morning. Now the morning was gone, and so was his gas. The storm was closing in again, the wind building, the snow coming harder. He could not see the trees 20 feet away. The cold had found the gaps in his clothing, his collar, his cuffs, the place where his parka pulled tight across his shoulders. It was eating into him, stealing warmth from his core, and he knew with a certainty that sat in his stomach like a stone that if he stayed here, he would not last the night. He left the snowmobile and started walking. The compass was in his pocket, but the needle spun in circles, useless in this valley where the iron in the rocks pulled it every direction at once. He tried to use the wind instead, keeping it at his back, but the wind kept shifting, changing direction every time the storm paused to gather itself. He walked until his legs burned, until his lungs ached with the cold air, and when he stopped to catch his breath, he realized he had been curving to the left. He was lost. The thought arrived without panic, without drama. It was simply there, a fact like the temperature or the time of day. He was lost, and he was miles from the cabin, and the storm was getting worse, and the sun would set in 2 hours, and after that there would be no light at all. He found a rock outcropping on the side of a slope, a shallow overhang that gave him just enough shelter to crouch out of the wind. He cleared the snow with his hands, his movements slow and deliberate because fast movements meant sweat and sweat meant faster freezing. He had a fire starter in his pack, and he found birch bark and dead twigs and built a small flame in the lee of the rock. The fire died 3 times before he got it to stay. He fed it with twigs and branches, using the last of his energy to keep it alive. The warmth was pathetic, barely enough to take the edge off the cold, but it was something. He leaned into it, feeling the heat on his face, watching his mittens steam as he held them out to the flame. He thought about Elena. He thought about her hands, how small they had been, how cold they always were in winter. He used to wrap them in his own hands, blow on them, rub them until the blood came back. She would laugh and call him her furnace, her personal heater, and he would pretend to be annoyed, but he had loved it. He had loved being warm for her. Now he was alone in a storm, and his hands were cold, and there was no one to warm them. He thought about the promise he had made her the last week, when she was too weak to leave the bed. "Don't disappear out there," she had said. "Don't become one of those men who vanish into the woods. Promise me you'll stay." He had promised. He had meant it. And now here he was, doing exactly what she had feared. The fire was dying again. He reached for the last of the twigs, his fingers thick and clumsy, and the match he was trying to light slipped from his grip. He watched it fall into the snow, watched the flames sputter and die, and he felt something in his chest crack open. He was going to die here. The wind paused. In that silence, he heard something move. He lifted his head. The snow was still falling, still thick, but for a moment it parted, and he saw a shape at the edge of the firelight. Dark fur, darker than the shadows, and a face with amber eyes. She came closer. She moved with a limp, favoring her right front paw, the same uneven gait he had seen in the tracks that followed his snowmobile trail. She stepped into the circle of dying firelight, her breath fogging in the cold, and looked at him with eyes that held no fear. He knew her. After a year, after everything, he knew her. She turned and walked 3 paces into the snow. Then she stopped, looked back at him, and waited. He stood up. His legs did not want to hold him, and his hands were too cold to close, but he stood. He picked up his pack. He walked toward her. She moved forward, and he followed. He did not decide to follow her. His legs simply moved, carrying him forward into the white blur, and the wolf moved ahead, always visible, always waiting. She walked at a pace that matched his exhaustion, not too fast, not too slow. 20 paces, then she would stop and look back, her breath fogging in the cold, her ears swiveled forward. When he caught up, she would turn and walk again. The rhythm became everything. Step, breathe, watch her dark shape against the snow. Step, breathe, watch. He stopped thinking about the cabin, about the cold, about the way his hands had gone from numb to burning to a strange, distant warmth that he knew meant danger. There was only the wolf and the next step and the next. She kept her head low, her tail level with her spine, and he noticed for the first time that her fur was not entirely black. In the brief moments when the wind parted the snow, he could see silver-guard hairs along her back and a pale patch on her chest that pulsed with each breath. Her right front paw dragged slightly with every step, leaving a furrow in the snow that filled behind them as fast as she made it. He remembered the trap, the sound it made when it opened, the blood on the snow, the way she had looked back at him from the tree line with those amber eyes. That was a year ago, and here she was, leading him through a storm, and he could not make sense of it because there was no sense to make. Wolves did not do this. Wild animals did not remember a man who had helped them once, did not track him through the forest, did not appear in a blizzard to guide him home. And yet she was here. He stumbled on a buried branch, went down on one knee, and for a moment he thought he would not get up again. The cold had stolen the strength from his legs, and the snow was soft and deep and inviting. He could lie down here, just for a minute, just to rest. The wolf came back. She stood over him, close enough to touch, and she made a sound, not a snarl, not a growl, but a low whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She pushed her muzzle against his shoulder, a quick, hard shove, and then she was walking again, looking back, waiting. He got up. The second hour was worse than the first. The wind had not stopped, and the snow had not let up, and the light was fading from gray to the deep blue of twilight. He could not feel his feet anymore. His hands had curled into claws inside his mittens, and when he tried to flex his fingers, they would not obey. But he kept moving because the wolf kept moving, and somehow that was enough. He began to talk to her. It was nonsense, mostly, bits of memory, fragments of thought that came loose in the cold. He told her about the cabin, how he had built it with his father 30 years ago, how the roof leaked in the spring but held against any snow. He told her about Elena's garden, the tomatoes that never ripened, the way she would curse at the frost and then laugh, because what else could you do? He told her about the photograph on the mantel, the one he looked at every morning and every night, the one he had stopped being able to see clearly because he had looked at it too many times. She listened, or she did not listen. She was a wolf. She did not understand words, but she stayed close, and that was the same thing. The trees began to thin. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the way the storm played with shadows and distance. But then he saw the clearing, the familiar shape of the ridge, the old logging road that led to his property. The cabin was there, at the edge of the trees, a dark square against the snow. He stopped walking. The wolf had stopped too. She was sitting at the edge of the clearing, her head turned toward the cabin, her breath steady in the cold. She did not look at him. She sat there like a sentinel, like a door that had opened and would not close until he walked through. He moved past her, his legs heavy, his chest tight. The cabin door was locked, and his hands would not work, and he dropped the keys twice before he got the key into the lock. When the door finally opened, the warmth hit him like a wave, and he almost wept. He turned around. The wolf was gone. The clearing was empty except for the falling snow, and there were no tracks leading away from the cabin, only the one she had made coming in. He stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold seeping in around him, waiting for something that did not come. He closed the door. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, but there was heat in the iron, and he fed it kindling and split wood until the flames caught and the cabin began to warm. He stripped off his frozen clothes, his fingers clumsy, and hung them by the stove to dry. He made tea with shaking hands and drank it standing up because he was not sure his legs would hold him if he sat down. When he was warm enough to move, he went to the door and opened it. The tracks were still there, a single line of prints leading from the trees to the cabin, circling once and then stopping. There were no tracks leading away. The snow had fallen steadily since he came inside, and the wind had been blowing, and there should have been nothing left but drifts. But the prints were clear, and they ended at his doorstep as if she had simply vanished into the air. He stood there until the cold drove him back inside. When he closed the door, he saw a single strand of dark fur caught on the door frame, caught on a splinter of what he had meant to sand down for 3 years. He pulled it free and held it in his palm, black and silver against his skin. He put it in the pocket of his coat, the one he wore every day, and he told himself it was just a memory, just a piece of the night that he would forget by spring. He did not believe it. 3 weeks passed before Philip went back to the place where he had freed her. The storm had settled into a hard winter after that night, the kind that kept men indoors and made the forest hold its breath. He had spent those weeks repairing what the cold had damaged. The water pump froze twice, the stovepipe needed replacing, a window cracked in the bedroom, and let in a draft that made the whole cabin feel like a meat locker. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, but every morning he found himself looking at the tree line, and every night he listened for sounds that were not the wind. The strand of fur stayed in his coat pocket. He told himself he should throw it out, that keeping it was sentimental in a way he had never been, not even with Elena. But it stayed, and sometimes when he reached for his keys or his gloves, his fingers found it, and he would stand there for a moment with his hand closed around nothing but hair and memory. He went back on a clear morning, the temperature holding at 20 below, the sky the color of old ice. He did not take his rifle. He told himself he was just checking the trap line, though he had not set any traps since the storm, and the ones he had left out were buried under 3 feet of snow. He followed the logging road to the ridge, then cut south through the cedars until he found the fallen hemlock. The trap was still there. He had expected it to be gone. Someone's trap, someone's responsibility, someone who would come back for it when the weather broke. But it sat exactly where he had left it, the jaws rusted open, the chain wrapped around the roots. The snow around it was undisturbed except for the tracks of mice and the fine powder that had sifted down from the branches above. No one had come for the trap. No one had even looked. He crouched beside it and studied the rust on the teeth, the way the iron had stained the snow a dull orange. The trap was old, the kind that had been illegal for a decade, and the chain was wrapped with a skill that spoke of someone who knew what they were doing but did not care about the law. A trapper from the old days, maybe, or someone who lived far enough out that they thought the rules did not apply. He looked around for other signs, footprints, boot marks, anything, but the snow had erased everything except the trap itself. He found her tracks 100 yards north, where the cedars opened into a small clearing. She had been there recently, that morning, maybe, or the night before. The prints were sharp, the edges still crisp, and they told a story he did not want to read. She was favoring the right paw, the same uneven gait he had memorized on the night of the storm, but there were other tracks too. Larger tracks, tracks that did not favor anything. He followed them for an hour. The larger tracks belonged to a male wolf, and he was big, bigger than any wolf Philip had seen in 30 years of walking these woods. Each print was the size of his palm, the claws leaving deep gouges in the crusted snow. The wolf moved with purpose, his stride long and straight, and his trail crossed the females again and again, sometimes following, sometimes leading, always overlapping. He found the kill at the edge of a frozen creek. It had been a deer, a young buck, and the carcass was stripped clean, the bones scattered across the ice. But there were 2 sets of tracks around the kill, and they did not feed together. The male had eaten first. His prints were everywhere, the snow churned and bloody. The female had come later, after he was gone, and taken what was left. Her tracks circled the carcass at a distance, hesitant, watchful. He knew what he was looking at. The male was pushing her out, taking the territory, taking the food, taking everything. She was surviving on the edges of his range, eating what he left behind, moving when he moved. He found more tracks before he turned back, wolf and wolf, predator and predator, the same story written over and over in the snow. She was losing. She would keep losing until one of them died or she left the territory entirely. The sun was low when he reached the logging road again, and the cold had deepened, the way it always did when the light went out of the sky. He walked back to the cabin with his head down, his mind turning the same thought over and over, and when he reached the clearing he stopped. There were tracks at the edge of his property. Wolf tracks. Her tracks. She had come while he was gone, walked the boundary of his land the way she had walked the edges of the kill, and then turned back into the forest. She was watching him the way she watched the male, keeping her distance, waiting to see what he would do. He went inside and built up the fire and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning he walked into town for the first time in weeks, and the woman at the general store told him about the bounty. "Big gray wolf," she said, stacking cans of beans on the shelf. "Took a calf from the Henderson place last week, and a dog from the Millers before that. Conservation officer says it's only a matter of time before it goes for something bigger. They're offering $500 for proof of kill." She looked at him with eyes that held something between respect and pity. "You're the only one who knows those woods. They need you out there, Philip. Someone's got to do something." He bought his supplies and drove home without answering. That night he sat on his porch and watched the tree line. He thought about the trap, the rusted teeth, the way the chain had wrapped around the hemlock roots. He thought about the male wolf, the size of his tracks, the way he had taken the deer and left her the bones. He thought about the bounty, the money, the faces of his neighbors when they talked about the wolf like something that needed to be removed. He thought about her eyes in the firelight, the way she had pushed her muzzle against his shoulder to keep him from lying down in the snow. He went inside and put the rifle in the cabinet and did not take it out again. The next morning, he told the conservation officer he would not trap the male. "I'll watch him," he said. "If he comes for livestock, I'll handle it. But I won't kill him for being wild." The officer looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your choice. But when that wolf takes something you care about, don't come crying to me." He went home and found her tracks on his porch for the first time. She had come close while he was gone, closer than she had ever come, and left nothing behind but the prints and a single tuft of dark fur caught on the door. The calf was gone before anyone knew the wolf was there. Philip heard about it from Pete Henderson at the general store, Pete's hands shaking around a cup of coffee, his face gray with exhaustion and anger. "Took it right out of the barn," he said. "Broke the latch, dragged it into the trees. Didn't even hear a sound until the dog started up, and by then it was too late." The store was quiet. Everyone in town knew the Hendersons had been struggling, that the calf was meant to be the start of rebuilding their herd after a bad year. Now there was nothing left but blood in the snow and tracks the size of a man's hand. "Conservation officer says it's the same one," Pete said. "The big gray. They're calling it Monty now. Says it's lost its fear of people." Philip bought his supplies and left without saying much. He drove back to the cabin with the windows down, letting the cold air clear his head, and when he got home he sat at the table with the rifle across his knees and tried to figure out what he was going to do. He had told the officer he would not trap the wolf. He had meant it. But Pete Henderson was his neighbor, had helped him shore up the cabin roof 2 winters ago, had driven into town for supplies when Elena was sick and Philip could not leave her side. There was a debt there that could not be paid in promises. He spent the next 3 days walking the boundary between the forest and the cleared land, looking for sign. Monty had gone to ground after the calf, smart enough to know that men with guns would be looking for him. But he was still there. He spent the next 3 days walking the boundary between the forest and the cleared land, looking for sign. Monty had gone to ground after the calf, smart enough to know that men with guns would be looking for him. But he was still there. Philip found his tracks at the edge of the Miller property, circling the chicken coop, testing the fence. He found them again near the old logging road, following a deer trail, patient and methodical. The wolf was hunting, and he was not afraid. On the 4th day, Philip found the female. She was in the high country, the ridge above the creek where the pines grew thin and the wind scoured the snow into hard drifts. She was thin, thinner than she had been 3 weeks ago, her ribs showing through her dark coat, her limp more pronounced. She was hunting mice, pouncing at the base of a deadfall, coming up empty again and again. He watched her from 100 yards away, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. She was tired. She was hungry. And everywhere she moved, Monty's tracks were there, overlapping hers, claiming the ground she walked on. He stayed hidden for an hour, watching her work the deadfall. She caught a vole on her 5th attempt, a small brown thing that she swallowed in 2 bites, and then she sat down in the snow and rested her head on her paws. She looked old, though she was not old. She looked like something that was running out of time. He thought about what the conservation officer had said. "When that wolf takes something you care about, don't come crying to me." The officer had meant Monty, but Philip was looking at something else now. Something he cared about. Something that was being taken from him one day at a time. He left before she noticed him, and he spent the night in his truck at the edge of the Henderson property, watching the tree line with the rifle across his lap. The next week passed in a blur of patrols and half-sleep. He walked the forest by day, looking for sign, and sat by his truck by night, waiting for something he could not name. Monty stayed in the deep woods, away from the cleared land, and the townspeople stopped talking about the bounty. They had other things to worry about: the price of fuel, the coming cold, the way the snow kept falling and did not stop. It was late afternoon when Philip found the den. He had been following a set of tracks, not Monty's, the female's, into a narrow canyon he had not visited in years. The walls were steep rock, the floor choked with fallen timber, and at the back, under an overhang of stone, there was a hollow that had been used as a den for generations. The scent was old, the bedding scattered, but he could see where she had tried to make it her own again. Monty's scent was everywhere around the entrance. He had marked the den, claimed it, driven her out. Philip crouched in the snow and looked at the place where she had tried to live, and he felt something settle in his chest. This was not about territory anymore. This was about survival. And somewhere in the calculation of who lived and who died, he had already chosen a side. He was walking back through the narrow canyon when he heard the growl. Monty stood on the trail ahead of him, blocking the path. He was bigger than Philip had imagined, a massive gray wolf with shoulders that came up to Philip's thigh and yellow eyes that held no fear. His muzzle was scarred, his ears torn, his lips pulled back from teeth that were yellow and long. He did not snarl. He simply stood there, watching, waiting for Philip to make a move. The rifle was in Philip's hands. He could raise it, fire, in this. The bounty would cover his expenses for the winter. Pete Henderson would have his revenge. The town would stop whispering about the strange man who lived alone and fed wolves. He raised the rifle. Monty did not move. The wolf's eyes held his, and for a long moment there was nothing in the world but the cold and the snow and the space between them. Philip thought about the trap, the rusted teeth, the way the chain had wrapped around the hemlock roots. He thought about the storm, the way she had pushed her muzzle against his shoulder to keep him from dying. He thought about the photograph on the mantel, Elena's face, the soft heart she had named in him. He lowered the rifle. Monty watched him for another heartbeat, then turned and walked into the trees. He did not run. He did not hurry. He moved like something that had already won, and Philip stood in the canyon with the rifle hanging at his side and felt the weight of the choice he had just made. He went home that night and found her waiting. She did not. She turned and vanished into the dark. But in the morning, there was a rabbit on his porch. It was still warm, the blood fresh on the snow, and he knew she had left it there. The trap took him 3 days to build. He worked in the shed behind the cabin, welding the frame from old rebar he had been saving for a project he never got around to. The cage was 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, tall enough for a wolf to stand but not tall enough for comfort. He fitted a sliding door with a trigger mechanism he had used before for live trapping beaver, and he tested it 20 times before he was sure it would close cleanly and fast. He did not want to kill Monty. That was what he told himself when the work went late and his hands cramped from the cold metal. He did not want to kill anything that looked at him the way Monty had looked at him in the canyon. Not a monster, not a devil, just another creature trying to survive in a place that did not forgive weakness. The wolf was dangerous, yes. The wolf had taken Pete Henderson's calf and would take more if nothing changed. But there was a difference between stopping something and destroying it, and Philip had spent his whole life learning the difference. He loaded the cage into the back of his truck at dawn and drove to the boundary of Monty's territory, the stretch of forest between the Henderson place and the ridge where the wolves had been fighting. He set the cage in a clearing, baited it with a slab of deer meat from his freezer, and covered the floor with pine branches to hide the metal. Then he found a rock shelf 50 yards away, one that gave him a clear view of the trap, and settled in to wait. The first day, nothing came. He sat in the cold with his binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the bait grow stiff in the wind. The sun moved across the sky, pale and useless, and the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, and still nothing came. He ate frozen sandwiches and drank tea from a thermos and tried not to think about the cabin, the stove, the bed that was warm and empty. The The second day, Monty came. He appeared at the edge of the clearing just after noon, a gray shape that seemed to materialize from the trees. He moved slowly, his head low, his nose working the air. He circled the cage once, twice, 3 times, each circle wider than the last. He smelled the deer meat. He smelled the iron of the cage, the sweat of Philip's hands on the metal, the oil on the trigger mechanism. He stood at the edge of the clearing, 50 feet from the bait, and he looked directly at the rock shelf where Philip was hiding. Philip held his breath. Monty watched him for a long minute. Then the wolf turned and walked back into the trees, and he did not come back that day. The third day was different. Philip had settled into his spot before dawn, the cold seeping through his coat, his fingers stiff around the binoculars. The bait was still there, untouched, and he was beginning to think the trap was a failure, that Monty was too smart to be caught. He was about to pack up, to admit that he had wasted 3 days on a plan that was never going to work, when he heard the sound. It was not a growl or a howl. It was something worse, a yelp, high and sharp, cut off before it finished. He was on his feet before he knew he was moving, the rifle in his hands, his legs carrying him toward the sound. He burst through the trees into a small hollow he had not seen before, and he stopped. Monty had shadow pinned against a fallen log. They were locked together, teeth and fur and blood. The snow churned to mud beneath them. Monty was bigger, stronger, his jaws clamped on Shadow's shoulder, shaking her like a dog with a rat. She was fighting back, her teeth buried in his leg, but she was losing. She was always losing. Philip raised the rifle and fired into the air. The shot cracked through the hollow, echoing off the rocks, and Monty released his grip. He stood over Shadow for a moment, his yellow eyes finding Philip, his lips peeled back from teeth that were red with blood. Then he turned and vanished into the trees, moving fast, leaving nothing behind but the silence and the wolf bleeding in the snow. Philip went to her. She did not move when he knelt beside her. Her flank was heaving, her breath coming in short, wet gasps, and the wound on her shoulder was deep, the muscle torn, the blood pumping out onto the snow. He put his hand on her side, and she did not pull away. She turned her head and looked at him with eyes that were not afraid. He opened his pack and pulled out his field kit. He had used it on himself a dozen times, on dogs once or twice, never on a wolf. But the hands that shook were steady enough when he poured antiseptic into the wound, and she did not bite when he pressed the bandage against her skin. She lay still under his hands, her breath slowing, her eyes half closed, and he talked to her while he worked, nonsense words, her name, the things he should have said a long time ago. When he was done, he sat beside her in the snow, his back against the log, his hand resting on her shoulder. She did not move. She did not try to run. She lay there with her head on her paws, her breath warm against his leg, and the sun went down and the stars came out, and the cold wrapped around them like something that had been waiting. He thought about Elena, about the garden, about the photograph on the mantel. He thought about the trap, the chain, the way she had looked back at the tree line a year ago. He thought about Monty, the yellow eyes, the choice he had made in the canyon, and the choice he had made tonight. He did not know what any of it meant. He did not know if it meant anything at all. But she was alive, and she was here, and her head was heavy against his leg, and that was enough. In the morning, she was gone. The snow around the log was trampled. The bandage he had tied was lying in the hollow, and there was blood on his coat where she had rested her head. He looked for tracks, but the wind had erased everything. He walked back to the truck and drove home. He did not look at the cage in the back, did not think about the bait that was still waiting in the clearing. He went inside and built up the fire and sat in the chair by the window, and he waited for something he could not name. That night, something scratched at his door. He opened it slowly, the cold rushing in, and found nothing but the dark. But there were tracks in the snow at his feet, leading from the tree line to the porch and back again. One paw dragged slightly, the track uneven, the furrow deep. She had come to check on him. She came back a week later, and after that she did not leave. Philip noticed the change on a morning when the temperature had finally broken, rising to 10 below, almost warm enough to work outside without a hat. He was splitting wood in the yard, his axe rising and falling in a rhythm he had known since he was old enough to hold one. And when he turned to stack the split pieces, she was sitting at the edge of the clearing. She was watching him the way she had watched him for months, from a distance, her body angled toward the trees, ready to run. But something was different. Her ears were not flat against her skull. Her tail was low but not tucked. She was watching him the way a dog watched its owner, waiting for something she could not name. He did not acknowledge her. He turned back to the woodpile and kept working, and when he looked again she was closer, 20 feet into the clearing, sitting in the snow with her head cocked. The next day she was on the porch. He came out in the morning to check the thermometer and found her lying on the boards, her paws tucked under her, her eyes half closed. She did not move when he opened the door. She lifted her head, looked at him, and put it back down. The wound on her shoulder was healing, the fur starting to grow back over the pink scar, and she was not as thin as she had been before. She had been eating, hunting, surviving. He walked past her to the woodpile, and she did not follow. When he came back with an armload of split birch, she was still there, her breath fogging in the cold, her eyes tracking his movements with a patience that was older than either of them. The neighbors started to talk. It was Pete Henderson who brought it up first, catching Philip at the general store on a Saturday afternoon. "Heard you got yourself a pet wolf," Pete said, not quite joking. "People are saying she comes right up to your door." "She's not a pet," Philip said. He was loading cans into his box, keeping his hands busy. "She comes and goes. She's wild." "Wild things don't sit on a man's porch," Pete said. There was something in his voice, not quite accusation, not quite fear. "Wild things don't follow you home through a blizzard and lead you to your door." Philip did not answer. He paid for his supplies and drove home. And when he got there, she was waiting at the edge of the clearing, watching the road. She had been there the whole time. She knew he was coming before he turned the corner. The conservation officer came by the next week. His name was Roy, a thick man with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too many winters to be surprised by anything. He sat at Philip's kitchen table and drank the coffee Philip offered and looked out the window at the wolf sleeping on the porch. "She's been here 3 weeks now," Roy said. It was not a question. "She comes and goes," Philip said. "She's not going anywhere." Roy set his cup down. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. You saved her. She saved you. That's between you and whatever you believe in. But you need to understand what happens if she goes into town." Philip knew. He had been telling himself the same thing every night, lying in bed with the sound of her breathing on the porch, the scrape of her claws against the boards when she shifted in her sleep. The town would not see what he saw. They would see a wolf, a predator, a threat. They would shoot her and ask questions later. "She won't go into town," he said. "You don't know that." "I know her." Roy looked at him for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Keep her here. Keep her away from people. That's all I'm asking." He stood up and put his coat on. "And Philip? That other one, the big gray. He's still out there. He's still taking stock. People are going to want something done." After Roy left, Philip sat at the table and watched her through the window. She was awake now, her head up, her ears swiveled toward the road where Roy's truck had disappeared. She knew something had changed. She could feel it the way she felt everything, the shift in the wind, the change in the light, the weight of a man's attention. He went outside and sat on the steps beside her. She did not move away. She turned her head and looked at him, her amber eyes catching the low winter sun, and for a moment he saw something in her that he had not seen before. Not fear, not trust, but something in between, something that was still deciding. He thought about what Roy had said. People are going to want something done. He thought about Monty, the yellow eyes, the way the wolf had looked at him in the canyon. He thought about the trap he had built, the 3 days he had spent waiting, the shot he had fired into the air instead of into the wolf's chest. He had chosen a side. He had chosen it the night he freed her from the trap, the night she led him home, the night he fired into the air instead of into Monty's ribs. And now he had to live with what that meant. He reached out and touched her shoulder, his fingers finding the ridge of scar tissue beneath her fur. She did not pull away. She leaned into his hand, just for a moment, just enough to feel the warmth of her skin through his gloves, and then she stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing. She stopped at the tree line, looked back, and waited. He did not follow her. He sat on the steps and watched her stand there, her breath fogging in the cold, her eyes fixed on his. She was not asking him to come with her. She was telling him something else. She was telling him that she would be back. She turned and vanished into the trees. He sat there until the sun went down, and when he went inside, he left the door open behind him. The cold rushed in, but he did not close it. He built up the fire and put water on for tea, and he waited. At midnight, he heard the scratch of claws on the boards. She came through the open door and lay down in front of the stove, her body curled in a tight circle, her nose tucked under her tail. She was inside. She had crossed the threshold. He closed the door and sat in his chair and watched her sleep until the fire burned down to coals and the first light of morning began to show through the windows. The howl came from the clearing at midnight, and Philip knew before he opened his eyes that Monty had come. He had been sleeping in the chair by the stove, the way he had slept every night since Shadow began staying inside. She was curled on the floor beside him, her head on his boots, her breathing slow and even. But when the howl cut through the walls of the cabin, she was on her feet before he was, her ears flat, her lips pulled back from teeth that gleamed in the firelight. He reached for the rifle. The howl came again, closer this time, a sound that was not a song but a challenge. Monty was at the edge of the clearing, calling her out, calling her to fight. Philip could hear him moving through the snow, his steps deliberate, his breath fogging in the cold. He was not afraid of the cabin. He was not afraid of the man inside it. Shadow ran to the door and scratched at the wood, her claws scoring deep grooves in the boards. She wanted out. She wanted to meet him, to finish what they had started in the hollow. Philip put his hand on her back and felt the tension in her muscles, the heat of her, the wild thing that had never been tamed. "Not yet," he said. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle in his hands, and he saw Monty at the far end of the clearing, a gray shape against the white snow. The wolf was watching him, his head low, his tail straight out behind him. He was not running. He was waiting. Shadow slipped past Philip's legs and stood on the porch steps, her hackles raised, her teeth bared. The two wolves faced each other across the clearing, and the silence between them was worse than any howl. Monty moved first. He charged across the snow, fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move, and Shadow met him halfway. They collided in the center of the clearing, a tangle of fur and teeth, and Philip heard the snap of jaws and the high whine of an animal that had been hurt. He raised the rifle, but he could not get a clean shot. They were moving too fast, locked together, rolling in the snow. He ran down the steps and into the clearing, shouting, firing the rifle into the ground at their feet. The snow exploded, and for a moment the wolves broke apart. Monty stood over Shadow, his muzzle red with blood, his yellow eyes finding Philip. Shadow was on her side, struggling to get up, her shoulder bleeding where Monty had reopened the old wound. Philip fired again, the shot going wide, and Monty backed away. He did not run. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Philip with something that was not fear. It was understanding. He knew now. The man would not let him finish this. Shadow got to her feet, her legs unsteady, her head low. She was bleeding from the shoulder and from a gash on her face, and she was breathing hard, but she was standing. She took a step toward Monty, and Philip put his hand on her back, stopping her. "No," he said. "Stay." She looked at him, and for a moment he thought she would ignore him, that the wild in her would carry her forward no matter what he said. But she stopped. She stood beside him, her shoulder pressed against his leg, and she did not move. Monty watched them for a long minute. Then he turned and walked into the trees, and the silence he left behind was deeper than any sound. Philip did not sleep that night. He sat on the porch with Shadow beside him, the rifle across his knees, and he watched the tree line until the sky began to lighten. She had stopped bleeding, but the wound on her shoulder was deep, and he would need to clean it again when the sun came up. She rested her head on his leg and closed her eyes, and he sat very still so he would not wake her. In the morning, he went into the cabin and packed his pack. He put in dried meat, extra ammunition, the field kit, a compass that would work in the Iron Valleys. He was going after Monty, not to trap him, not to kill him, to find him, to understand him. Shadow followed him to the edge of the clearing and stopped. "Stay," he said. She sat down in the snow and watched him go. He tracked Monty for 2 days. The wolf led him through the high country, across frozen creeks, into valleys where the sun never reached. He was smart, circling back on his own trail, doubling through thickets that tore at Philip's clothes, always staying just ahead. But he was leaving tracks, and Philip knew how to read them. On the second afternoon, he found Monty waiting. The valley was a bowl of ice and stone, the walls too steep to climb, the floor too wide to cross quickly. Monty stood in the center, his head low, his tail straight, his yellow eyes fixed on the man who had been following him for 2 days. He was not running anymore. Philip raised the rifle. The wolf did not move. He stood there in the snow, his breath fogging, his sides heaving from the long run, and he looked at Philip with eyes that held no fear. He was not a monster. He was a wolf who had been pushed to the edge, who had fought for what he needed, who had killed because that was the only way he knew to live. Philip thought about the calf, about Pete Henderson's face, about the fear that had spread through town like a sickness. He thought about Shadow, the wound on her shoulder, the way she had pressed against his leg in the clearing. He thought about the trap, the chain, the way Monty had come for her again and again, because that was what wolves did when the world was not big enough for both of them. He lowered the rifle. "Go," he said. Monty watched him for a long moment. Then the wolf turned and walked to the far end of the valley, his pace unhurried, his head high. He did not look back. He climbed the far wall and disappeared over the ridge, and the valley was empty except for the wind and the snow and the man who had let him go. Philip walked home in the dark. When he reached the cabin, Shadow was waiting on the porch, her head up, her ears forward. She came down the steps to meet him, limping slightly, and she sniffed his hands and his coat and his face. She smelled the snow, the trees, the wolf he had followed. She smelled Monty. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and walked back to the porch and lay down in her spot by the door. That night, Monty howled from the far ridge, miles away, the sound thin and distant. Shadow lifted her head, listened, and did not answer. The howl came again, and then it faded, moving further, until there was nothing left but the wind and the silence and the snow falling on the tracks that would be gone by morning. The snow began to melt in the second week of March, and with the melt came a change Philip had not expected. He noticed it first in the way the light stayed longer in the evenings, the sun slipping behind the ridge an hour later than it had in January. The temperature climbed to 20 below, then 10, then 0, and the ice on the creek began to groan and shift, water moving beneath the frozen surface for the first time in 4 months. The cabin smelled different too, less of smoke and frozen wool, more of damp earth and the pine resin that heated up under the strengthening sun. Shadow spent more time outside now, ranging further than she had all winter. She would leave at dawn and return at dusk, her fur wet with melted snow, her belly full, and Philip would watch her from the porch and wonder what she was doing out there. Hunting, probably. Or maybe just walking the territory that was now hers. The valley that Monty had abandoned when he crossed the ridge and did not come back. The conservation officer, Roy, came by again in the middle of the month. He parked his truck at the edge of the clearing and walked up to the porch with the careful gait of a man who had been charged by moose and had learned to announce himself before he arrived. Shadow was not there, but Roy looked at the tracks around the cabin, wolf tracks, days of them, and raised his eyebrows. "She's still with you," he said. "She comes and goes," Philip said. The words had become a ritual between them, a dance where both knew the steps, but neither wanted to change them. Roy sat on the porch steps and pulled out a cigarette, cupping his hands around the lighter. "Monty's gone." Trapper up near Fort Nelson reported a big gray, scarred muzzle took 2 of his dogs. "That's 100 miles north. He won't be back." Philip leaned against the door frame and watched the smoke rise from Roy's cigarette, thin and gray against the pale sky. He should have felt relief, he thought. The threat was gone. The town was safe. Shadow's territory was hers again. But what he felt was something else. A quiet emptiness, the kind that came after a door had closed and the room had gone still. "We've got a position opening up," Roy said. His voice was casual, the way people's voices got when they were asking for something they did not know how to ask for. Wolf management, tracking populations, handling conflict calls, working with landowners. They want someone who knows these woods, someone who understands wolves. Philip did not answer. He looked out at the clearing, the snow that was pulling back from the tree line, the patches of brown earth that were starting to show through. The cabin had been his world for 3 years, a small circle of warmth in a cold country, and he had told himself that was enough. It was what he had wanted after Elena died, to be alone, to be quiet, to let the forest cover him like snow covering a fallen tree. But the snow was melting now, and the ground underneath was not as frozen as he had thought. "I'll think about it," he said. Roy nodded and left, and Philip sat on the porch for a long time after the truck had gone, watching the light change and the shadows lengthen. Shadow came back at dusk, her paws wet, her fur dark against the snow, and she lay down beside him with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep. He put his hand on her back and felt the warmth of her, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and he thought about what it would mean to leave this place, even for a few days at a time. That night he dreamed of Elena. She was in the garden, the one she had planted behind the cabin, and the tomatoes were ripe on the vine, heavy and red, the way they had never been when she was alive. She was wearing the blue dress she had worn on the day they got married, and her hands were dirty with soil, and she was laughing at something he could not hear. "You're not a hunter," she said in the dream, the same words she had said before. "You never were. You're just someone who needed to be alone, and the woods let you." He woke with the dream still in his chest, the sound of her voice still in his ears, and he lay in the dark until the first light began to show through the windows. Shadow was asleep on the floor beside his bed, her nose tucked under her tail, and he watched her breathe until the sun came up. He took the job. He told Roy the next day, and he told Pete Henderson the week after, and he told himself that it was not a betrayal of the life he had built here. He would keep the cabin. He would come back on weekends. He would walk the woods and track the wolves and tell the farmers what they needed to know to keep their livestock safe and their rifles in their cabinets. It was not leaving. It was learning to live in both places at once. The first week of April, he packed his truck with the things he would need for the new job: notebooks, maps, a radio that could reach the office in town. Shadow watched him from the porch, her head cocked, her ears forward, and when he got into the truck and started the engine, she did not follow. She sat at the edge of the clearing and watched him drive away, a dark shape against the brown earth and the patches of snow that still clung to the shadows. He drove to town and parked in front of the conservation office, a low building on the main street that smelled of coffee and paper and the kind of work that happened indoors. He sat in the truck for a long moment, his hands on the wheel, and he thought about turning back. He did not turn back. He got out and walked inside, and when he came out again in the evening, there was a desk with his name on it and a stack of files waiting for him and a calendar on the wall that showed the days of the month in neat squares. He drove home with the windows down, the air warm for the first time in half a year, and when he pulled into the clearing, Shadow was waiting for him at the edge of the trees. She did not come to the truck. She watched him unload his pack, watched him walk to the porch, watched him sit on the steps and look out at the forest that had been his home for 3 years. Then she walked to the porch and lay down beside him, her head on his foot, her eyes half closed. He reached down and touched her ear, the soft fur behind it, and she did not pull away. "I'm not leaving," he said. The words were for her, or for himself, or for both of them. "I'm just learning how to stay." She lifted her head and looked at him, her amber eyes catching the last light of the day, and he knew that she understood something. Not the words, but the shape of them, the meaning beneath. That night, they sat on the porch together, the man and the wolf, and the stars came out one by one, and the wind that blew across the clearing was warm for the first time in months, and Philip thought about the photograph on the mantel, Elena's face, the garden that would not grow. He thought about the trap, the chain, the way she had looked back at him from the tree line a year ago. He thought about Monty, the yellow eyes, the choice he had made in the valley. He thought about the days ahead, the work that waited for him in town, the life he was building out of the pieces of the old one. He did not know if it would hold. He did not know if he would stay or leave or find some place between. But Shadow was beside him, and the stars were out, and the snow was melting. That was enough for tonight. A year passed, and then another, and Philip learned to live in 2 worlds at once. The cabin stayed the same through all of it. The roof that leaked in spring, the stove that ate would like a hungry thing, the photograph of Elena on the mantel that he dusted every week whether it needed it or not. But the man who came back to it on Friday afternoons was not the same man who had left on Monday mornings, and he knew it the way he knew the difference between the tracks of a gray wolf and a coyote, the way he knew the weight of a rifle that he did not need to carry anymore. The job had changed him. He spent his days in the truck or on the trails, tracking wolves, talking to farmers, teaching them how to read the signs that told them when a wolf was hunting and when it was just passing through. He showed them how to protect their livestock without killing, how to build fences that turned predators away, how to live beside the wild instead of trying to push it back. Some of them listened. Some of them did not. But the ones who listened stopped losing calves, and the ones who did not kept calling Roy to complain, and Philip kept showing up anyway. He learned to talk to people again. It came slowly, the way the snow came in December, a little at first, then all at once, until the silence he had built around himself was buried under something new. He ate lunch with Roy on Tuesdays, drove out to the Henderson place on Saturdays to help Pete with the fence, even went into the bar once or twice to watch the hockey game and let the noise wash over him like water. He did not love it. He was not sure he ever would, but he did not fear it anymore, and that was something. Shadow came and went as she always had, wild and untamed, but there was a rhythm to her now that he had learned to read. She would disappear for a week at a time when the hunting was good, and he would come home to an empty porch and tracks that led into the forest and did not come back. He would wait, and she would return, and they would sit together in the evenings without needing to say anything at all. The first winter after he took the job, a developer came to town with plans for a resort on the ridge. It was the kind of thing that had happened to other towns, places where people came to see the mountains and the lakes and the forests that had not been cut yet. The developer stood up at the town meeting and talked about jobs, about tax revenue, about putting this place on the map. Philip sat in the back and listened, and when the developer was done, he raised his hand. He did not prepare what he said. He stood up and talked about the wolves that denayed on the ridge, about the family of foxes that had lived in the talus slope for 20 years, about the old-growth cedars that had been there before anyone could remember. He talked about the trail that ran along the top of the ridge, the one that the wolves used to move from one valley to the next, the one that had been there since before the town was built. He talked about what it meant to live in a place that was still wild, and what it cost when you tried to make it something else. He did not think anyone was listening. But when the vote came, the ridge was saved. He went home that night and found Shadow waiting on the porch, her head up, her ears forward, and he sat beside her and looked out at the forest that was still there, that would still be there tomorrow. He thought about Elena, about the garden that had never grown, about the photograph on the mantel that he had stopped being able to see clearly because he had looked at it too many times. He thought about the trap, the chain, the way she had looked back at him from the tree line. He did not know what any of it meant. He was not sure it needed to mean anything. In the spring of the third year, he went back to the place where he had freed her. The fallen hemlock was still there, the roots still wrapped around the stone, but the trap was gone. He had taken it out 2 years ago, carried it down to the creek and thrown it into the deepest pool, watched the water close over the rusted iron and the teeth that had torn her leg. There was nothing left now but the memory, and even that was fading, worn smooth by the years. He stood at the base of the hemlock and looked at the ground where she had bled, and he thought about the man he had been that day, cold, alone, hiding from the world in a coat that was too thin and a silence that was too thick. He had thought he was saving her. He had thought he was doing something that mattered. But she was the one who had saved him. She had walked through the storm, through the snow, through the dark, and she had led him home. He turned to go, and he saw her at the edge of the clearing. She was old now, he realized. The silver on her muzzle had spread to her face. Her coat was thinner, her limp more pronounced. She sat in the snow with the patience of something that had waited a long time and was willing to wait a little longer, and she looked at him with eyes that were still the same amber they had been on the day he found her in the trap. He walked toward her, and she did not move. He knelt in the snow beside her, and she leaned into him, her head against his chest, her breath warm through his coat. He put his arms around her and held her there, and the snow fell around them, soft and silent, covering the tracks that had brought them to this place. He did not know how long they stayed like that. The light changed, the shadows lengthened, the cold deepened. And then she pulled away, slowly, carefully, and looked at him one more time. She walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped. She did not look back. She walked into the trees, and the snow closed behind her, and she was gone. He waited on the porch that night, but she did not come. He waited the next night, and the night after that, and she did not come. He walked the trails he had walked with her, the ridges where she had hunted, the creek where she had drunk, the clearing where she had slept in the sun. There were tracks everywhere, the tracks of deer and moose and coyote, the tracks of the wolves that had moved into the territory when Monty left. But he did not find hers. He told himself she had moved on. He told himself that wolves did not stay in one place forever, that they followed the herds and the seasons, that she was somewhere in the mountains, hunting and sleeping and doing what wolves had always done. He told himself that she was not gone, that she would come back when she was ready. He told himself these things, and sometimes he believed them. On the last day of winter, he walked to the ridge where he had let Monty go. The snow was deep, the wind was cold, and the sun was low on the horizon, painting the peaks in shades of pink and gold. He stood at the edge of the valley and looked out at the country that had been his home for as long as he could remember, and he thought about the years he had spent here, the winters and the summers, the storms and the calms. He thought about the photograph on the mantel, and for the first time in a long time, he could see Elena's face clearly. She was smiling, the way she had smiled on the day they built the garden, the way she had smiled when he told her he loved her, the way she had smiled when she made him promise to stay. He had kept that promise, he realized. He had stayed. He turned to walk back to the cabin, and he saw a shape at the edge of the trees. It was not her. It was a younger wolf, dark-furred, with a patch of silver on its chest and a gait that was easy, unhurried. It sat in the snow and watched him with eyes that were the color of amber, and for a moment he could not breathe. The wolf stood, turned, and walked into the forest. It did not look back. It did not need to. Philip walked home in the twilight, and when he reached the clearing, he stopped. The cabin was there, the porch was there, the photograph on the mantel was waiting. But something was different. He looked at the tree line, at the shadows that were gathering between the trunks, at the tracks that crossed the boundary of his land. There was a single set of prints, fresh, leading from the forest to the porch and back again. They were small, the stride short, the gait uneven. One paw dragged slightly, leaving a furrow in the snow that would fill by morning. He smiled. He did not know why. He smiled, and he walked to the porch, and he sat on the steps and watched the stars come out, one by one, until the cold drove him inside. The photograph was where it had always been. He looked at it for a long time, and then he put it in his pocket and went to bed. In the morning, the tracks were gone. The wind had erased them, the snow had covered them, and there was nothing left but the clearing and the cabin and the forest that stretched to the mountains and beyond. He stood on the porch with his coffee and looked out at the trees, and he waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. He did not know if it would come. But the path was there, the one she had walked that first winter, the one he had followed through the storm when he had nothing left to hold on to. It was still there, under the snow, under the years, under the silence that had settled over everything. He put on his coat and walked to the edge of the clearing. He did not look back. He walked into the trees, and the snow was soft under his feet, and the light was bright on the ridges, and the path went on ahead of him, into the country he had known all his life and was only now beginning to see. He walked until the cabin was out of sight, until the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He walked until he found the place where the trail forked, one branch leading east to the river, one branch leading north to the high country, one branch leading west to the place where the wolves had their dens. He stood there for a long time, looking at the tracks that crossed the fork, reading the story they told. A deer had passed through at dawn, a coyote had followed an hour later, a lynx had crossed in the night, leaving prints as soft as a whisper. And there, at the edge of the trail, almost hidden in the shadow of a pine, were the tracks of a wolf. They were fresh. They were small. One paw dragged slightly, leaving a furrow in the snow. He did not follow them. He stood and watched them lead into the trees, into the country where he could not go, into the life that was hers and hers alone. He stood and watched until the light shifted and the tracks seemed to fade, and then he turned and walked back the way he had come. The cabin was waiting. The porch was waiting. The photograph was in his pocket, and the years were ahead of him, and the path was still there, under the snow, waiting for the next time he needed to find his way home. He did not know if she would come back. He did not know if the tracks he had seen were hers or another's, a memory or a promise or just the wind playing tricks with the light. But he knew that somewhere in the mountains, in the valleys and the ridges and the forests that had been wild before he was born and would be wild after he was gone, there was a wolf with a scar on her shoulder and a limp in her step and eyes the color of amber. And that was enough. He closed the door and built up the fire, and he sat in his chair and waited for the morning.